They filled the room with gold, but the door did not open. I was Atahualpa, ruler of the Inca world, victor over my brother, prisoner of strangers in Cajamarca. History would later remember me as the emperor who offered a ransom and still died. But before the gold was weighed, before the rope tightened, I had believed the empire was mine to command. I had just survived a war inside my own bloodline. Armies had moved for me across mountains, valleys, and cold high roads. Messengers had carried my orders faster than most men could ride. Men bowed when my name passed through their mouths. And yet, in the end, I waited inside a stone chamber while foreigners counted the metal of my world. I was not born as the name you remember. I was not born as a captive, or a warning, or a figure in a story about conquest. Before Cajamarca, before Pizarro, before the gold, I belonged to a world that thought itself vast. We called it Tawantinsuyu, the realm of four parts. It stretched over mountains so high the air itself seemed to test a man's strength. It ran down into valleys, across deserts toward the sea, and along roads cut into impossible stone. To later eyes it became an empire on a map. To me it was breath, ceremony, labor, hunger, command, and fear. My father, Huayna Capac, ruled that world before me. Under him, roads carried runners, storehouses held grain, and officials measured what villages owed. The empire was not held together by softness. It was held by order, obligation, memory, and the knowledge that power could reach you. When I was young, I learned that a ruler did not simply possess a kingdom. He had to be seen, feared, obeyed, and believed. The mountains taught patience, but the court taught suspicion. Every gift had weight. Every smile could hide a calculation. A great empire seems solid from far away, like a wall of stone. From inside it, you can hear the cracks before anyone else can see them. My early life belonged to the north, to armies, commanders, and the unsettled edges of power. Later accounts do not agree on every detail of my birth, my standing, or every promise made around succession. But no ruler is shaped only by the facts that survive on paper. I was shaped by the men who watched me, the soldiers who followed me, and the danger of being almost royal enough. In a family of rulers, blood does not always protect you. Sometimes it marks where the knife should go. My father's death did not simply remove a man. It loosened the bindings around an empire already stretched across too much land and too many ambitions. Disease had moved through our world before we understood what had come with the strangers. Death took powerful people and left questions behind. Questions are dangerous when soldiers are waiting for answers. Huáscar, my brother, held the ancient prestige of Cusco. Cuzco was not just a city, it was memory, origin, and legitimacy carved into stone. I had strength in the north, where armies knew my name and commanders trusted my cause. Between us stood not merely jealousy, but the problem of an empire with more than one center. You may want a simple story. One brother rightful, the other ambitious. One loyal, the other treacherous. History often enjoys that kind of shape. But those who live inside power rarely receive such clean choices. I could have submitted and trusted that my brother would leave me space to breathe. Perhaps that is what a wiser man would say now. But men who have seen courts up close know that mercy is not a foundation. It is a mood, and moods change. I did not believe I could survive by becoming small. So I chose the path that rulers often pretend they were forced to take. I chose war. The war between Huáscar and me was not a war between strangers. It was an Inca war against Inca, a wound opened inside the body of the empire. The same roads that carried tribute now carried armies. The same messengers who once bound the realm together carried orders for brother to strike brother. My generals fought with skill and cruelty. His supporters fought with the belief that they defended the older order. The empire watched itself bleed and called it succession. I will not pretend there was no blood on my rise. Power does not climb cleanly over a civil war. Men died because my claim needed to become fact. families chose sides because neutrality was another kind of danger. I saw victory approach, and I did not ask whether the cost had already weakened the world I wanted to rule. That is one of power's oldest traps. It makes survival feel like proof. When Huáscar was captured, the ground beneath me seemed to settle. The old authority of Cuzco had been broken. My commanders had done what I needed them to do. The empire, or so I thought, would have to accept the answer that war had given. I stood near the height of my life. From there, danger often looks smaller than it is. The strangers from across the sea had already entered our world. They were few in number, and that mattered to me. A ruler surrounded by armies learns to count men before he counts omens. The Spaniards had horses, steel, loud weapons, and a hunger that showed itself in the eyes. But they did not look like an army that could swallow Tawantinsuyu. They looked like a problem to be observed, perhaps even used. I had heard reports about them before I saw them. Their animals carried them as if man and beast had become one shape. Their metal flashed in ways our weapons did not. Their faces, clothing, and customs marked them as people from beyond our known order. Still, strangeness is not the same as strength. I had faced brothers, commanders, cities, and armies. I did not yet understand that a small force can become deadly when it enters a divided world. That was my mistake. Not the only one, but perhaps the one history finds easiest to point at. I believed I could receive them from a position of superiority. I believed my presence, my army, and my rank would define the meeting. I believed the world still obeyed the rules by which I had risen. Power is dangerous when it teaches you that the next room will resemble the last battlefield. Cajamarca waited in the highlands, cold and open, with stone walls and a wide square. I was nearby with forces that made the Spaniards' number look almost laughable. To them I may have seemed careless. To me, caution had to be balanced with majesty. A ruler who shows fear in front of strangers gives something away before the first word is spoken. I came into Cajamarca carried with ceremony. I did not enter as a fugitive or a supplicant. I entered as a man who had recently broken his enemies and expected the world to know it. Around me were attendants, nobles, and the visible signs of power. But the Spaniards had prepared a different kind of theater. They hid their men around the square. They placed fear where I could not see it. They understood something rulers sometimes forget. A ceremony can become a trap if the space belongs to someone else. There are different accounts of the words spoken that day. Chroniclers wrote from their own worlds, with their own purposes. Some remembered religion, some defiance, some confusion, some insult. I will not claim to give you every word exactly as it fell, but I can tell you what mattered. The square changed in an instant. Sound broke open. Horses charged, steel flashed, guns and shouting tore through the air. Men who had entered in order were crushed by panic. The ceremony collapsed before it could become negotiation. I was seized alive. That was the center of the disaster. Many died around me, but the empire's body was captured through my body. My army still existed beyond the square. My commanders had not vanished. The roads, storehouses, officials, and soldiers of Tawantinsuyu had not disappeared. But I could no longer step freely into them. A ruler in captivity becomes both man and symbol. His breath continues, but his command is chained. In that stone room, I began to learn how quickly power changes shape. Yesterday, men had moved because I spoke. Now, the Spaniards watched my hands, my face, my messengers, my silences. They did not understand my world fully. I did not understand theirs fully. Between us stood interpreters, gestures, suspicion, and gold. Gold, that is what later centuries loved to remember. They make the room shine so brightly that everything else becomes shadow. But gold was not merely decoration to us. It belonged to temples, palaces, vessels, ornaments, and the visible order of sacred and royal life. The Spaniards saw wealth. They saw metal that could be melted, divided, shipped, possessed. Their hunger for it was not hidden. It moved through them like fever. I saw that hunger and thought it could be used. If gold was what they wanted, then perhaps gold could buy time. Perhaps it could buy life. Perhaps it could buy the reopening of a door. I offered to fill a room with gold and more with silver. Whether I believed I was purchasing freedom, survival, or delay, I knew I was bargaining with men who valued metal intensely. The order went out. Objects began to travel. From temples, storehouses, palaces, and noble hands, gold and silver moved toward Cajamarca. The empire that had carried messages and armies now carried pieces of itself to my prison. Imagine watching your world arrive as fragments. A vessel that once held ceremony, an ornament that once marked rank, a plate, a figure, a sacred object, a worked surface catching torchlight on stone. To the Spaniards, each piece was weight. To me, each piece had come from somewhere. A place, a hand, a ritual, a memory. That is what conquest often does first. It teaches one people to weigh what another people had known how to revere. The room filled, the promise of gold became a mountain inside walls. Men measured, sorted, melted, argued, and waited. Outside, the empire trembled. Inside, I listened to footsteps and tried to read the faces of men who had already decided how much my life was worth. Captivity sharpens certain truths. You learn which servants still look at you with loyalty. You learn which enemies become braver when a wall stands between you and your army. You learn that even silence can become a rumor. Every message from outside carried danger. Every delay gave the Spaniards more time to fear me. They were few and they knew it. That is important. The men who held me were not calm masters of an inevitable future. They were frightened, ambitious, divided men inside a world they had barely begun to understand. They feared my generals. They feared an attack from beyond the town. They feared what might happen if I walked out alive and gathered the empire around me. Their fear did not make them merciful. It made them more dangerous. A captive ruler can be more threatening than a dead one. As long as I breathed, men could act in my name. As long as I lived, the Spaniards held not only a prisoner, but a fire they could not safely carry. They wanted my gold. They also wanted the world my name controlled. Those desires could not live together forever. There is another shadow in my story, and I will not hide from it. Huáscar died while I was in captivity. Many accounts place responsibility on orders connected to me. I had fought him, captured him, and seen him as a rival whose existence threatened my claim. If you ask whether I was innocent in the struggle for power, the answer is no. I did not rise by gentleness. I did not inherit a peaceful throne and lose it through mere bad luck. I won a brutal contest and then was caught by a more unfamiliar brutality. This is why I do not ask you to make me clean. I ask only that you see the whole shape. A man can be both victim and maker of violence. An empire can be wounded from within before invaders cut deeper from without. A ruler can misjudge strangers partly because he has spent too long surviving relatives. The Spaniards put me on trial. Think of that word carefully. Trial. Men who had entered my land, seized me by ambush, taken my gold, and feared my release now dressed their decision in judgment. They accused me of rebellion against a king I had never chosen. They accused me of idolatry, as though their language could make my world into a crime. They accused me in connection with Huáscar's death, and there at least the shadow was not empty. But justice was not the room's true master. Necessity was. Fear was. Greed was. The decision had been growing long before the sentence was spoken. A living Atahualpa was a problem. A dead Atahualpa could become an opening. That is how conquerors often think. They do not always need to understand a society in order to break its center. They only need to understand which body holds too much meaning. My body held too much meaning, so they prepared to remove it. There are moments when a ruler feels the empire shrink to the size of his own breath. Not the roads, not the armies, not the mountains, only breath. In that final narrowing, gold no longer mattered. The room no longer mattered. Even victory over Huascar seemed distant, like another man's memory. I had wanted the world to answer my command. Now I waited for men who could not pronounce my world properly to decide how I would die. Some accounts say I accepted baptism before death, changing the manner of execution. The details have been repeated, argued, and shaped by those who wrote after me. What remains certain is simpler. I did not leave Cajamarca alive. On that day, the man who had won the Inca Civil War ceased to be a living center of power. But do not think the entire Andean world ended in one breath. That is another simplification history enjoys. After me, resistance continued. Names changed, claimants appeared, alliances shifted. The Spaniards used division as carefully as they used steel. Empires rarely die as neatly as stories want them to. They break unevenly. A city falls here, a noble bargains there, a general resists, a brother changes sides, a temple is stripped, a road still carries feet. My death did not erase Tawantinsuyu in a single instant, but it struck at the center during a moment when the center had already been weakened. The Civil War had done some of the Spaniards' work before they fully understood it. I had helped create that weakness. So had Huascar. So had the hunger of inheritance. So had disease, distance, fear, and the terrible size of the realm we tried to command. This is not the simple story of a great empire defeated by a handful of men. Nor is it only the story of foreign weapons and horses. Those mattered. Of course they mattered. But steel enters most easily where trust has already cracked. The Spaniards stepped into a world that had just torn itself open. They found rivalries, grief, unsettled loyalties, and exhausted armies. They found men who had reasons to choose one power against another. They found me at the summit of victory, and victory had made me exposed. I often wonder, in the language of memory, what I should have seen. Should I have refused the meeting? Should I have crushed them before they entered the square? Should I have kept Huascar alive as a brother, a hostage, or a symbol of unity? These questions belong to the living. The dead answer only with consequences. A ruler does not get to return to the moment before misjudgment. He lives inside it until others give it a name. They gave mine many names: captive, emperor, pagan, tyrant, victim, fool. Last Inca, some would say, though history is never that clean. Labels are easier to carry than contradictions. A label does not require you to imagine the cold of Cajamarca. It does not ask you to hear the noise of the square. It does not ask you to see gold as something more than treasure. It does not ask you to remember Huascar's blood beside mine. But I remember more than the labels. I remember the high roads. I remember the thin air pressing against the chest. I remember soldiers standing in rows, waiting for a movement of my hand. I remember the authority of a litter carried through watching crowds. I remember the faces of men who had followed me because they believed I would win. I remember the terrible sweetness of being obeyed. That sweetness is dangerous. It teaches a man that the world has become an extension of his will. Then one day, a door closes. A few men stand between you and your armies. Your name still travels, but your feet do not. Your commands leave the room, and you cannot know what shape they take outside. This is how power humiliates those who trusted it. It remains visible after it has become useless. The gold in Cajamarca was visible. My rank was visible. My attendance, my bearing, my memories of command were visible. But the thing I needed most was invisible and gone. Control. Once control leaves, dignity must do the work that power used to do. So I sat like a ruler because I could not move like one. I bargained because I could not command. I watched because watching was what remained. Do not imagine I understood everything at once. Men rarely recognize the end while they are inside it. They call it delay, negotiation, uncertainty, danger. Only later does history call it collapse. Inside the room, each day still had ordinary weight. Food arrived. Guards shifted. Messages came. Metal piled higher. A man can live many small days inside the shadow of one great ending. That is what people forget. Tragedy is not always loud. Sometimes it is the scrape of sandals on stone. Sometimes it is a torch burning lower. Sometimes it is the face of an enemy who will not meet your eyes because he already knows what will happen. I have been told through the voice history gives the dead that people still visit that room. They look at the walls and imagine the ransom. They picture gold rising like sunlight inside a prison. They wonder how so much wealth could fail to save one man. But the question is not why gold failed. The question is why I believed it could succeed. I believed it because I had seen value command men. I had seen tribute move. I had seen objects carry authority. I had seen wealth prove obedience. I did not yet understand that these men wanted not a bargain, but a future in which my world could be taken apart. Gold was not the price of my freedom. It was the first inventory of conquest. Piece by piece, they learned what could be removed. Piece by piece, my world entered their hands. And when enough had entered, the man who had ordered it gathered became unnecessary. That is the cruelty hidden inside the ransom story. It makes my death sound like betrayal after payment. It was more than that. It was the moment when the Spaniards understood that the treasure and the prisoner did not need to remain connected. Once they had the gold, my living body became risk without reward. So they chose the reward and ended the risk. You may ask whether I hated them. Hatred is too small for what happens when worlds collide. I feared them, studied them, underestimated them, bargained with them, and recognized too late the direction of their hunger. I had hated Huascar in the way rivals hate when only one future can survive. The Spaniards were different. They did not want only my defeat. They wanted entry into the meaning of everything I ruled. They came with their own king, their own god, their own hunger, and their own certainty. Certainty is a weapon. I had carried mine too. The certainty that victory proved right. The certainty that rank would be understood. The certainty that numbers would matter more than surprise. The certainty that an empire, even wounded, could absorb a handful of outsiders. Those certainties died before I did. In the end, I do not stand before you asking to be forgiven. Forgiveness would make the story too soft. I ordered violence. I fought my brother. I mistook danger. I believed power would protect me. But I also stood at the meeting point of forces no single man could fully master. Civil war, disease, ambition, steel, horses, gold, faith, fear. The empire did not fall because of one mistake alone. Yet my mistake had a room, a date, and a face. That is why history finds me useful. It can point to me and say, here is the emperor who filled a room and still died. It can make me a lesson about greed, arrogance, conquest, or fate. Lessons are easier than lives. Lives are crowded. Mine held triumph and brutality, ceremony and panic, command and helplessness. Mine held the moment when a brother's defeat seemed to open the world, and the moment when strangers closed it again. If I could speak across the stone of Cajamarca, I would not begin with the gold. I would begin with the silence after the square. That was when I understood that something impossible had happened. Not defeat in battle, not the loss of a city, not the death of a rival. Something stranger. The order of the world had failed to recognize itself. My people knew how a ruler should appear. The Spaniards knew how a captive could be used. Between those understandings, I disappeared. A ruler is partly flesh and partly belief. They seized the flesh first. Then they learned how to use the belief. They let messages move in my name when it served them. They watched who obeyed. They measured the reach of my voice while keeping my body still. Captivity made my own authority visible to my captors. I became, in their hands, both prisoner and instrument. That is another humiliation history often misses. To be defeated is one thing. To have your remaining power used by those who defeated you is another. Each command sent from the room carried my name outward, but not my freedom. Each object of gold sent inward proved that the empire still heard me. And every proof that I still mattered gave them another reason to kill me. This is the trap of captive power. If no one obeys you, you are useless. If too many obey you, you are dangerous. I stood between those two deaths. The Spaniards chose the one that suited them. When I think of Huáscar now, I do not see only an enemy. I see the other half of a broken inheritance. Had he won, perhaps he would have faced the strangers differently. Perhaps he would have made his own mistakes. Perhaps the empire would still have cracked under pressures neither of us created. But he did not win. I did. And so the burden of the ending fell through my name. This is the bitterness of victory. You inherit not only the throne, but the disaster waiting behind it. I had wanted Cuzco's authority, the army's loyalty, the obedience of a realm. I received them for a moment. Then I received the Spaniards. People imagine the fall of empires as thunder. They imagine burning cities, broken temples, armies collapsing in clouds of dust. Sometimes that happens. But sometimes the fall begins with a meeting, a square, a misunderstanding, a hidden cavalry, a captured body. Sometimes the world changes because a ruler walks into the wrong space believing he still controls the meaning of ceremony. That was Cajamarca. Not the whole ending, but the hinge. Before it, I was dangerous. After it, I was valuable. Then I was inconvenient. The distance between those words was measured in gold. I remember the metal shining in the low light. I remember how its brightness did not warm the room. Gold looks like sunlight, but it has no mercy. It can cover a floor, climb a wall, fill a promise, and still leave a man alone. The Spaniards touched it with hands that had crossed an ocean. I looked at it and saw roads, temples, labor, fear, and the obedience of a wounded realm. If there is a final image of me, let it not be only a king surrounded by treasure. Let it be a man listening for footsteps outside a door. Let it be a ruler trying to understand whether the next sound means release or death. Let it be a brother who won too late. Let it be an emperor whose world was larger than his prison and yet could not reach him. History remembers names because names are easier than rooms. Atahualpa, it says, ransom, Cajamarca, execution. A few words polished by repetition. But I lived in the spaces between them. I lived in the long road before the ambush. I lived in the war against my brother. I lived in the confidence that came after victory. I lived in the moment that confidence became blindness. I lived long enough to see strangers turn my sacred and royal objects into their accounting. And then I became what history needed. A symbol, a warning, a question no one can answer without discomfort. Was I the last great ruler of a world already breaking? Was I a cruel victor overtaken by crueler men? Was I arrogant, unlucky, betrayed, or simply too certain that the old rules still governed the new danger? The answer is not one thing. I was all of these and more. That is what a life becomes when history stops flattening it. I do not ask you to call me innocent. I ask you to stop making me simple. Do not let the gold blind you. Gold is only the part of the story that still shines. The rest is darker, heavier, and more human. A brother dead, an empire divided, a ruler captured, a foreign hunger misunderstood, a room filled with wealth that could not purchase trust. When my final hour came, the mountains did not move. The roads did not rise. The armies did not break through the walls. The world I had commanded remained outside me. That is the loneliness at the center of power. At the end, everything you ruled can be close enough to remember and too far away to save you. I had once believed the empire was something I could hold. But an empire is never held by one hand. It is held by fear, loyalty, habit, ceremony, violence, food, roads, and the fragile agreement that the center still stands. When the center is taken alive, everyone waits to see what the world means now. In Cajamarca, I was that center. Then I was removed. What followed was not silence, but it was no longer my command. Others would resist. Others would bargain. Others would die. Others would wear names that claimed continuity. But the moment of my own voice ended there. They could take my gold. They could take my breath. They could not make the story clean, no matter how often they told it. So listen once more, not to the shine, but to the stone. Listen to the room after the counting ended. Listen to the ruler who had won a war and lost the world beyond it. I was Atahualpa. I was not born in a ransom room. I was not made only for defeat. I was a son of power, a brother in war, a victor with blood on his hands, and a captive surrounded by the wealth of a dying order. History wrote my name beside gold. But I remember the cold floor. I remember the torchlight. I remember the door. And I remember understanding too late that a room can be full of treasure and still be empty of mercy.